The heat pressed down like a punishment, dry and endless. Dust coiled in hollows between rocks, and the buzz of flies hung heavy in the still air. A hawk cried overhead, circling lazily on a current of wind, its shadow sweeping across the canyon floor. There, tied between two sun-bleached cedar posts, was a man who used to be a sheriff. Elias Carr's head hung forward, chin resting against his chest. His lips were cracked, dry as the earth beneath him. Rope bit into his wrists, pinning him high above his head, shoulders stretched to the point of agony. His boots barely touched the ground. The left one had lost its heels sometime during the struggle that brought him here. His badge lay in the dirt a few feet away, half buried, reflecting a dull glint each time the light shifted. He had been out here too long. Long enough to forget time. Long enough to forget how many times he'd whispered for help that never came. His breath came shallow, ragged. Every rise of his chest was a test. He tried to lift his head, but could barely manage the weight of it. The world swam in his vision, shadows twisting into forms that weren't there. At first, he thought he imagined sound. A faint rustle, a hollow thud like hooves on dry stone. Then came the snort, low and sharp, followed by the scrape of hooves dislodging gravel. His swollen eyes flicked up. They stood at the edge of the clearing. For wild Mustangs, muscles taut beneath sun-slick coats. Not moving, just watching. The first was a coal-black stallion, taller than the others, a white streak cutting down the length of his nose. Beside him stood a dun mare with clouded left eye and a foal hiding behind her legs, its coat a muddy bay. But it was the fourth that caught Elias' breath, a silver roan with eyes the color of dusk. Broad-shouldered, neck arched, he looked like something carved from wind and bone. They didn't move toward him, didn't flee, just stared, ears twitching, nostrils flaring as if weighing the scent of suffering. Elias wanted to speak, to say something human to prove he was still alive. All that came was a croak. He coughed, and pain surged through his ribs like knives. The silver roan stepped forward. Elias' fingers twitched involuntarily. The movement made the ropes creak. "Easy," he rasped, though his voice barely broke the stillness. The stallion halted a few paces from him, head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on a man hanging in the heat. A flick of the tail. Then another step. "You're real," Elias whispered, "or I'm finally gone." He'd seen the roan once before, months ago, on a patrol near the Waterline Trail. The horse had been younger then, leaner. Elias had paused, simply watching from a distance as the stallion stared back before turning and disappearing into the hills. Something about that meeting had lingered with him, a calm moment in a life that was mostly noise. The mare snorted. The foal took a tentative step from behind her flank, then retreated again. The stallion came closer. Elias could see the dry blood on his own wrist now, crusted deep into the grooves of the rope. Flies gathered at the corners of his eyes, landing on his lips unafraid. The silver roan lowered his head, sniffing along the sheriff's boot, then up his leg, stopping just short of the blood-stained waistband of his trousers. Elias tried not to breathe too hard, afraid he might scare the creature away. But the stallion didn't spook. He looked up, straight into Elias' eyes. There was something ancient in the gaze. Not understanding, not the way a man understands, but presence, awareness. As if the Mustang had seen men like Elias before, broken and left for dead. The sheriff closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the stallion had moved beside him. Warm breath drifted against his shoulder. Elias felt the brush of a muzzle against his rope-bound wrists. He didn't move. A hoof pawed at the dirt near his foot. Then again, slow, purposeful. Elias whispered again, a prayer this time, though he wasn't sure who it was meant for. The sky, the earth, the ghost of his father, who always said a man's worth was measured by how he stood when everyone else sat down. But Elias wasn't standing now. He had stood once, stood against the Dalton brothers when no one else would, refused their bribes, called out their land fraud in front of the council, told the banker he'd rather die honest than live bought. And now here he was. A sharp breeze blew through the canyon, scattering dust. The silver roan lifted his head, ears flicking back. A sound reached them both, low and distant. Not the hawk, not the wind. Another horse. Elias strained to listen. The rhythm was uneven. A rider. The stallion stepped away, nostrils flaring, tail whipping. Elias felt his heartbeat quicken. The other Mustangs backed toward the rocks, forming a loose line. The foal pressed against its mother, trembling. Elias tried to stay conscious, tried to keep his focus locked on the ridge just beyond the boulders. And then he saw him, a young man on a tired-looking buckskin, riding hard, clothes soaked with sweat, hair plastered beneath a bent hat. The boy yanked the reins when he spotted the scene, boots skidding in the dust as he jumped off his horse. "Sheriff!" he cried. "Sheriff Carr." Elias could only lift his head a few inches. It was enough. The rider ran forward but froze when he saw the Mustangs, still lingering, still guarding. The silver roan turned to face him. The boy raised his hand slowly. "Easy," he whispered, almost reverently. "I'm here to help." The stallion stood his ground, and for a moment the canyon held its breath. Then the silver roan stepped aside. The boy fell to his knees at Elias' side, fumbling with the ropes, voice breaking. "I got you, Sheriff. I got you. Hang on." Elias smiled, barely. "You're late," he whispered. Then the world went dark. The lantern flickered in the corner of the infirmary, casting long shadows across the walls. It was the only light in the room, save for the pale moon spilling through the slats of the half-shuttered window. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of wet wood and churned earth. Inside, the silence was dense, broken only by the ticking of the old regulator clock and the sheriff's uneven breaths. Elias lay still on the cot, his chest rising slowly under a thin blanket. His face was sunburned and bruised, jaw unshaven, lips scabbed over. His right eye remained swollen shut. The ropes had left ridges around his wrists, angry and red. A glass of water sat untouched on the side table beside a basin streaked pink from sponge-washed wounds. Luke Marston sat in a chair pulled close to the cot, boots still caked in dried mud. He hadn't gone home. He hadn't even washed. Just sat there, arms on his knees, staring at the sheriff as if willing him to wake up. "You're stubborn," Luke muttered, voice hoarse. "Always were. Always tellin' folks what's right. What ain't? Guess even a whoopin' in a canyon full of vultures couldn't shut you up." The sheriff didn't respond, but a flicker passed across his brow, a muscle twitching just beneath the skin. Luke leaned forward. "They thought you'd die out there, didn't they? Daltons figured you'd just vanish like a coyote in a drought." Elias stirred slightly, a slow, almost imperceptible groan escaping his throat. Luke straightened. "You hear me?" The sheriff's eyes opened, barely. One good eye, bloodshot and glassy, found the boy's face. His lips parted, cracked and dry. Where it was more air than voice. Luke fumbled for the glass and brought it to Elias' mouth. "Here, just a sip." The sheriff drank slowly, barely more than a mouthful, but when he leaned back, a little color had returned to his face. His fingers twitched against the blanket. "Mustangs," he rasped. "They were real." Luke nodded, eyes wide. "Yeah, they sure were." Elias swallowed. "Silver One watched me. Wouldn't let me near you at first. I thought maybe they were going to trample me." The sheriff gave the smallest smile. "No, not them." There was a silence between them then. Not heavy, not empty, just quiet, as if both were trying to understand what had happened. How the wild had stepped in where man had turned away. After a while, Elias closed his eyes again, not from pain, just rest. Luke sat back in the chair, exhaling slowly. He didn't know what any of it meant. All he knew was he'd followed a feeling. Something deep in his gut had pulled him down that ravine. It wasn't just the vultures. It wasn't just concern. It was something else. The Mustangs had known. That night, Elias dreamed of the past. Not the clean kind. Not the kind you tell over poker and a whiskey. No, this was the kind that rose up like a fever and grabbed you by the throat. He saw his wife, Sarah, standing on the porch with their baby girl on her hip, waving goodbye the day he rode out to confront the Daltons. Her mouth had been tight, the corners dipped in worry. "Don't do this alone," she'd said. But he had. He always had. In the dream, the Daltons looked like giants, shadows in the flickering lamplight of the saloon where it had all gone wrong. He called them out, laid down the deed ledgers, the bank transfer receipts, the proof of land stolen from widows and sharecroppers. No one had stood with him. Not the mayor, not the preacher, not even the judge. He woke with a gasp, clutching at the blanket. Morning had come. Pale gold spilled through the window, warming the wooden floorboards. Someone had set a tin of broth near the table, still steaming. The chair beside his bed was empty, but his badge, bent and scratched, had been polished and placed gently beside his hand. He didn't touch it. Instead, he looked past it to the window. A single silver hair, coarse, thick, lay on the sill. His breath caught. Later that afternoon, he forced himself to stand. The doctor barked. The nurse clucked. But Elias ignored them all. He dressed slowly, painfully, pulled on his boots one at a time. The left still had no heel. Luke arrived just as he was about to leave. "You're not serious," the boy said, eyes wide. Elias buttoned the last of his shirt. "Where are my guns?" "Gone," Luke replied. "Dalton's probably stripped you clean." Elias looked at him, and for the first time in days, there was clarity behind his eyes. "I'm not going to fight." Luke frowned. "Then what?" "I'm going to find them." "The Daltons?" "No," Elias said, stepping past him, every movement stiff but full of purpose. "The Mustangs." The wind picked up that evening, rattling the oak trees along the ridge. Elias rode a borrowed gelding, Doc's old trail horse. Slow and sure-footed, perfect for a man still healing. He followed the path by instinct, not trail markers. He remembered the shape of the stones, the curve of the gully, the place where the earth fell away into a small clearing, the scent of sage, the wind. He found the spot just before sunset. The cedar post still stood, rope dangling from one like a forgotten ghost. The earth had been trampled. Hoof prints circled where he had been tied. Deep prints, wild prints. No shoes, no iron. The sheriff dismounted, tied the gelding to a dead branch, and walked into the silence. His legs ached. His ribs burned. But his mind was clear. He crouched near the post and touched the dirt. It was dry now, but the memory of rain lingered in the smell of it. His fingers found something buried just beneath the surface. A piece of old leather. A torn strip from his own belt. He pocketed it and stood. Behind him, a low snort. His pulse kicked up. He turned slowly. There, halfway up the ridge, stood the silver roan. Alone, the light caught his coat, making him look almost metallic. Like a creature born from storm clouds and firelight. His ears were forward, his legs unmoving. Elias raised a hand, palm open. The stallion didn't move. "I don't know what you are," the sheriff said softly. "But you saw me. You stayed, when no one else did." The stallion blinked slowly. Elias lowered his hand. "I just wanted to say thank you." And with that, he turned and walked back toward the gelding. Behind him, gravel shifted. A hoof moved. Elias didn't look back. Not yet. He waited until he reached the saddle, rested his hand on the pommel, and turned. The silver roan was gone, but his tracks remained, fresh, leading back into the hills. Elias mounted slowly, took one last look at the cedar posts, then clicked his tongue. The gelding moved forward. He didn't know where the trail would lead. But for the first time since he'd been tied up and left to die, Elias didn't feel like a man lost. He felt like a man following something worth finding. The days that followed blurred into each other like smoke on the wind. Elias rode slow, trailing the mountains to the west and letting the land guide him where maps could not. He didn't ask for directions. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. The people of Dry Creek watched him pass with wary eyes, their whispers coiling like dust devils behind him. Some nodded in respect. Others looked away. After what happened with the Daltons, trust didn't come easy. Not for anyone. But Elias wasn't chasing people anymore. He wasn't chasing justice either. What he sought couldn't be named. It moved with the rhythm of hooves and the silence of instinct. It existed somewhere beyond rules, beyond reputation, somewhere in the half-lit space between what you lose and what you still believe in. Each morning he found signs, scuffed earth, tufts of silver hair caught in barbed wire, hoofprints pressed deep into creek beds. Once he spotted them from a distance, cresting a ridge at twilight, silhouettes framed by the sinking sun. They didn't run. They simply watched, then turned, vanishing like ghosts into the hills. Elias never pushed, never called out. He let them keep their distance. Each night, he camped beneath open sky, the fire low, the air sharp with sage and pine. Sometimes he'd sit up late, listening to the rustle of unseen creatures. Coyotes called, owls hunted, and once, just once, he heard the soft whinny of a horse he hadn't brought with him. That night he didn't sleep. He sat cross-legged near the embers, badge in his palm, turning it over and over. It felt heavier than it used to, like it knew too much. He wasn't sure when he started talking aloud. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe the wind was lonely. "You saved me out there," he murmured. I don't know why. Maybe you remembered that foal I cut loose from the fence years back. Maybe you just saw something pitiful, hanging in the sun like meat, but you stayed. His voice cracked, quiet but steady. Most folks don't. The wind didn't answer. But somewhere out in the darkness, hooves shifted softly against rock. Elias closed his eyes and smiled. The next morning, he found them. Not all of them, just the roan. It happened in a meadow ringed by cottonwoods, the grass tall and gold in the early light. The air smelled of dew and old bark. Elias had stepped into the clearing, expecting emptiness. But there he stood, the stallion, still as stone, except for the slow flick of his tail. Elias stopped, hands relaxed at his sides. "Morning," he said. The horse didn't move. Elias took one step forward, then another, careful not to make it feel like a chase. "I'm not here to break you. I'm not even here to keep you. I just wanted to see if what happened back there, if it meant something." The stallion lowered his head slightly. Not a nod, just acknowledgement. Elias reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an apple, bruised, split near the stem, but still sweet. He placed it gently on a flat stone and backed away. The stallion watched him the whole time. Minutes passed. Then, without hurry, the roan stepped forward and took the apple between his teeth. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The stallion chewed slowly, then lifted his head, muzzle glistening. "That's all I got," Elias said. "Unless you like beans and dry coffee." The roan blinked. Then, to Elias's astonishment, the stallion stepped forward. 2 paces, close enough that Elias could smell his breath, warm and faintly sweet. He didn't lift a hand, didn't dare. He just stood there, waiting. And then the stallion lowered his head and nudged the sheriff's shoulder gently. The contact undid something in Elias he hadn't known was still wound tight. He blinked hard and turned away, voice hoarse. "Guess you just needed time." By afternoon, the rest of the herd had reappeared, one by one, as if summoned by a silent call. The black stallion with the white blaze, the mare with the cloudy eye, the colt, now taller and braver, trotting circles around his mother. They didn't approach Elias directly, but they didn't leave either. They accepted him, or at least tolerated his presence. Each day, he rode beside them, never too close, never too far. They grazed. They rested. They moved. He followed, or sometimes they followed him. The boundaries were soft, unspoken. Something changed in him, riding with them. He stopped thinking like a lawman, stopped rehearsing arguments in his head, stopped wondering what the Daltons were planning or what the mayor thought, or if the judge still slept easy at night. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was the way the colt trusted its mother enough to try new trails. The way the black stallion protected the herd's rear. The way the silver roan sometimes let Elias ride ahead, as if testing his direction. Trust wasn't declared. It was built, quietly, one shared silence at a time. But peace, Elias knew, was always temporary. And sure enough, trouble found him. It came in the form of a shot, sharp, distant, echoing across the canyon walls. The Mustang spooked, bolting for cover. Elias dropped from his gelding, hand on his old revolver, breath caught in his chest. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Then came the voices. 3 men, laughing. He recognized one immediately, Clay Dalton, the youngest of the brothers, hot-headed, cruel, and always too eager to prove himself. "Looky here," Clay called. "I told you he was out here, playing shepherd to a bunch of wild nags." Elias stood slowly, revolver low but ready. The 3 men emerged from the trees, rifle slung, eyes smug. They looked him over like he was a coyote caught in a snare. "I thought you died in that canyon," Clay said, grinning. "Not for lack of effort," Elias replied. "Should have stayed dead." Behind Elias, the Mustangs had vanished into the brush, silent as ghosts. Clay cocked his head. "You think we're scared of your little pet herd?" Elias didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the older man to Clay's left, Jeb Harmon. Not a Dalton by blood, but worse in some ways. The kind of man who only followed power. "You know what happens if you shoot me now," Elias said. "People will ask questions." Clay laughed. Didn't before. Jeb raised his rifle slightly. "I say we make it look like an accident. Got trampled by his own damn horses." "Then you'd better hope they don't hear you coming," Elias muttered. Before they could respond, a sound split the trees, a deep, primal shriek. Hooves. Fast. The black stallion burst through the brush like a thunderbolt, teeth bared, eyes wide. The mare followed close behind, flanking him. The silver roan came last, silent, unstoppable. Clay dropped his rifle. Jeb backed up, cursing. The horses didn't charge the men directly. They surrounded Elias instead, shoulders pressed close, flanks tense. A barrier of flesh and fury. The message was clear. "You'll have to go through us." Clay scrambled back. "They're crazy. They're damn feral." Elias stepped forward, calm as dusk. "No, they're loyal." Clay turned and ran. Jeb followed, stumbling over roots. The horses didn't give chase. They just stood there, steady and sure. When the last footstep vanished into the hills, Elias exhaled. The silver roan turned to face him. This time, Elias didn't hesitate. He raised a hand, and the stallion stepped forward, resting his forehead against the sheriff's palm. The sheriff's return to Dry Creek came without fanfare. No procession, no newspaper headline. He rode in at dusk, dust-caked and silent, the wind at his back and 4 wild Mustangs shadowing him like spirits. They didn't enter town. They lingered at the ridge line, hooves silent against stone, watching as Elias dismounted outside the old jailhouse and tied his reins with the same ease as 100 times before. People paused, peeking through half-closed shutters or stepping out onto porches, eyes narrowing as they realized who'd come home. Some whispered, others stiffened. A few removed their hats. None of them spoke. Elias said nothing either. He stepped into the jailhouse, the creak of the door echoing like thunder in a church. The desk where he used to sit was layered in dust. A calendar hung crooked on the wall, still turned to the month he'd disappeared. The badge, his badge, was nailed to the center of it, like a warning. He stared at it a long while, jaw tight, then pulled it free. He didn't pin it back on. Instead, he slipped it into his coat pocket and sat down at the desk, just like he used to, hands folded across the worn grain. By morning, the mayor arrived. Gideon Bright had always looked like a man trying too hard to be respectable. Hair combed flat, teeth too white, voice oily with concern. He stepped into the jailhouse with 2 deputies at his back and worry in his eyes. "Sheriff," he began. "I'm not your sheriff anymore," Elias replied without looking up. Bright hesitated. "The town, it needs leadership." Elias stood, slow and deliberate. "The town needed a spine 6 weeks ago, Gideon. Where were you when they left me to rot in the canyon?" The mayor blanched. "We didn't know." "You knew." The silence between them stretched like wire ready to snap. Bright cleared his throat. "What do you plan to do?" Elias stepped out from behind the desk and walked toward the door. "I plan to make sure no one else is left behind." He left the jailhouse behind, too. Let them keep the title, the keys, the rules that bent for the powerful and broke for the rest. He returned to land, to the wild edge where fences ended and hills began. built a modest corral not far from the cottonwood grove where he'd first seen the silver roan. No nails, no gates, just an open space and a worn log to sit on. The Mustangs came and went. Sometimes they vanished for days. Sometimes they arrived in the middle of the night, like dreams returning to a restless mind. People started coming too. First it was a widow with a lame colt, asking if he could help. Then a boy whose mare spooked at everything but quiet songs. Then a rancher whose stallion had turned mean after losing a foal. One by one, they brought him their broken, their wild, their nearly given up. Elias never charged a coin. He just listened, observed, spoke only when needed. Sometimes he said nothing at all. The Mustangs taught him that. That presence mattered more than noise. That healing came not with declarations, but with patience. Word spread. Not fast, but steady. Folks whispered about the sheriff who talked to horses, who healed with silence. Some called it magic. Others said it was guilt, or madness, or luck. Elias didn't argue. He just kept showing up. And slowly, Dry Creek began to shift. Not because laws changed, but because hearts did. The Daltons didn't return. Clay had been seen crossing into Arizona territory, and no one cared enough to follow. The judge retired. The banker moved east. The old structures of power, once towering and cruel, crumbled like dead wood. What rose in their place wasn't perfect, but it was honest. People remembered how close they'd come to letting a good man die. And some of them swore never to let that kind of silence settle over their town again. Elias lived simply. A cot in a barn. Coffee over a fire. Apples stacked in a wooden crate that doubled as a chair. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, he sat outside the corral, watching the silver roan graze beside the black stallion and the younger colt. The mare stood farther off, her cloudy eye fixed on the horizon. A breeze lifted the grass in slow waves. The world felt still, like it was holding its breath. Luke arrived with a wrapped bundle under one arm. "Figured you might want this," he said, setting the bundle down and unwrapping it slowly. Inside was a new saddle. Handmade, sturdy, no silver, no show, just leather, dark and clean. Elias touched the stitching. "Where'd you get this?" "Built it," Luke said with a small shrug. "Figure it was time I learned something useful." Elias looked up at the boy. "No, not a boy anymore. You've already learned plenty." Luke kicked at a stone. "You ever gonna come back to town?" "I am in town," Elias said, motioning toward the open air around them. Luke smiled, soft and tired. "You know what I mean." Elias didn't answer, because some things didn't need to be decided. Not yet. Later that night, under a sky scraped with stars, Elias stood beside the silver roan. "I don't know why you came for me," he said quietly. "I don't know what you saw." The stallion blinked, tail flicking, but I've stopped asking. He pulled the badge from his pocket and held it in the moonlight. Then he reached down and placed it on a flat stone near the corral gate, a small offering, not of surrender, but of release. "You saved me," he said, "not just in the canyon." After, the stallion stepped forward, pressed his forehead to Elias's chest, and in that quiet touch, Elias felt everything settle, not into perfect peace, but into place. He had come looking for something unreal, something beyond explanation. He'd found in the wild, in hooves and silence, in scars and second chances. And now, finally, he could rest,